Good afternoon and welcome to today's program here at the Korea Society's office on 350 Madison Avenue, um, charting future pathways for U.S. Korea-Japan relations. My name is Tom Byrne. I'm the president and CEO of the Korea Society. This program kicks off the spring 2025 session of the Kim Koo Professional Series. Established in 2015 with the support of the Kim Koo Foundation in Seoul, the series has now entered its 10th year. I'd like to begin by briefly discussing the namesake of this program series, Kim Koo. Kim Koo is one of the most admired persons in contemporary Korean history. Born in 1876, Kim Koo was a nationalist, pro-democracy reformer from the early age of 16, joining the famous Donghak movement that agitated against the Yi dynasty monarchy and foreign interference in Korea. Kim fled Korea during the Japanese colonization of the peninsula and became the first police chief of the Provisional Government of the Republic of Korea in Shanghai in 1927. He also served in the capacity of president of the Provisional Government several times. Kim retained a prominent role in the post-liberation politics in Seoul and sought to prevent a formal division of the country between the North and the South. On June 16, 1949, Kim was assassinated while he was at home reading poetry. The motive was apparently political. Kim Koo was a victim of the cross currents in the turbulent period between August 1945 and the onset of the Korean War in June 1950. Kim Koo dedicated his life to Korea's independence and peaceful unification. His most famous quote and the essence of Kim Koo's philosophy found in his autobiography titled My Desire is, I do not necessarily want our nation to become the richest and the most powerful in the world, but the one thing that I desire in infinite quantity is the power of a highly developed culture. This is because the power of culture is the one thing that grants happiness to the nation as well as to others. So we are pleased to kick off this spring 2025 series with a discussion on U.S. Korea-Japan trilateral relations. We have invited two top experts to help us examine the diplomatic, economic, and security dynamics affecting the trilateral relationship. Emma Chanlett-Avery is the Deputy Director of the Asia Society's Policy Institute's Washington, D.C. office and the Director of the Political Security and Director for Political Security Affairs. Prior to this, she served for 20 years as a specialist in Asian affairs at the Congressional Research Service. And Jonathan Corrado was an intern at the Congressional Research Service.
Very proudly so, yes.
Before joining the Korea Society. We're very pleased to have also Dr. Joshua Walker here. He became president and CEO of the Japan Society in December 2019. Previously, he worked at the Eurasia Group, where he served as the global head of strategic initiatives and Japan in the office of the president. Our moderator today for today's session is Policy Director Jonathan Corrado. And before I hand the stage over to Jonathan, I'd like to say that support for this program, financial support for this program, is provided by our corporate donors. They're all listed on the panel in the lobby right outside. We also encourage people to join as individual members. Individual membership is very important. We just restructured the membership structure. It's a lot more affordable to become a member. We're trying to improve benefits. And Stephanie Wong, I'd like to introduce you to Stephanie Wong in the back here. Raise your hand, Stephanie. She's our Director of Individual Membership. So if you're interested and feel altruistic this afternoon, you can approach Stephanie. You could also go to our website. At the top, we have a join button to click on. So, Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Joshua, Emma, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Korea Society. Welcome back to the Korea Society.
Thanks for having us. It's great to bring Korea Society, Asia Society, and Japan Society under one roof.
And, very much echoing the theme that we're trying to talk about today. And this is the first of many, I hope, and we can continue the good collaboration between our three institutions, mirroring that between the three countries under discussion today. So let's start with diplomatic and security. And we've seen thus far with the Trump administration some elements of continuity and some elements of change. So let's talk about the continuity first. We saw a trilateral foreign ministers meeting in February reaffirm the quote, unshakable trilateral partnership, end quote, of the three countries. Extended deterrence was discussed. Denuclearization was discussed of North Korea, not denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which was the formulation used previously, including in the Singapore summit. We've also seen joint naval exercises, trilateral naval exercises continue, including last week. In terms of what might be different this time, we've seen questions rise to the fore in terms of burden sharing that will affect the U.S.-Japan alliance and the U.S.-Korea alliance, defense spending, and also in terms of the extended deterrent question, right? In Seoul these days, there's a renewed discussion about perhaps pursuing what Japan has pursued in terms of nuclear latency. So questions on their minds in that direction. So where do you think we're headed right now? What factors are going to tighten trilateral security cooperation? What factors are going to complicate and make it more difficult? And which direction do you think we're headed? Emma, we'll start with you, then over to Josh.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jonathan, for having me here. It's great to be here with two of my favorite New York-based policy wonks. It's great to be back here after a couple of years. So a whole nest of questions you asked in that very meaty intro. I think the first thing fundamentally to look at is that the success of the Biden administration in terms of the trilateral relationship and the breakthrough Camp David Accords very much had to do with mending Seoul and Tokyo's relations, right? Getting those two leaders to be on the same page and set some of the more thorny issues aside. So the health of that relationship was what was key to making trilateralism work. I think now we're in a very different space where it's the health of Washington's relationship with South Korea and Japan that is more under question. And I think to a great extent, the strength of those alliances and whether or not they waver or are fortified is what's going to make or break trilateralism going forward.
Joshua.
Yeah, to pick up right where Emma left off, and it is good to be back with Korea Society. I think in some ways we all kind of owe it to ourselves to try to keep this trilateral relation going, because domestic politics is doing us no favor, right? With what's going on in Korea right now, what's going on in the United States right now, Japan actually seems like one of the few stable actors out there, and yet if you look beneath the surface, you will see that there's a lot of change going on here. And so, while it may appear on the surface that there is kind of continuity, I'm a little bit worried. Secretary Hegseth is on his way out to Asia right now, I believe. There's things going on in Washington. If you're using a signal channel, that might be related to what we're talking about. And so it's going to be overshadowed in some ways. And so I was at the Munich Security Conference just last month, where the Korean foreign minister and the Japanese foreign minister had not only a cordial meeting, but a series of discussions. And we discussed this idea. And it's clear that on both sides, in Seoul and Tokyo, continuity is the name of the game. They don't really want to see much change, but we have this impending kind of liberation day coming with tariffs that both Korea and Japan might be on the wrong side of. And so I think in some ways, the Seoul-Tokyo relationship is probably in about as good of a shape as we could expect with what's happening in Korea with domestic politics and what's happening in Japan, but it's really what is the Trump administration going to do? And so if there is continuity in U.S. policy towards both Korea and Japan, I think that, we're probably in a good place. I think the incentive structures for the domestic politics isn't a good thing, partly because the geopolitical environment is so unstable right now. Yeah. When you have North Korean troops in Ukraine fighting there directly and learning and adapting, this is a pretty volatile situation. And so in many ways, this is not the time for domestic politics. But of course, elections are coming, at least in Korea and in Japan. So what does that mean going forward? And we've got 2 more years to go before we have an election, but probably 4 more years before the commander-in-chief election begins.
Right.
Yeah, let me just add on to that a little bit. We just don't know what Trump's Indo-Pacific agenda is going to look like. We are waiting for that to form. And a lot of that's going to have to do with his approach to China, whether or not he wants a deal with Beijing. So I think everyone, as you said, is sort of looking to stabilize the relations within Asia while we see what comes out of Washington. And speaking of Washington, I don't want to sound like too much, this is sort of a bureaucratic thing, but we all know what's happening to the federal workforce in Washington, where broad swaths of it are being removed or laid off by DOGE. And I think that when you're talking about the health of alliance relationships and certainly trilateral arrangements, which are even more complicated, you need those folks at like the working level to be working on those. This is like, it's tedious. This is not sexy work, that you do when you're an alliance manager, but it's critical to making these things work. And this is, the Trump administration, as we know, doesn't have as strong of a commitment to alliances, I think it's fair to say, whereas Biden had sort of an alliance-centric foreign policy in many ways. And there's not, patience isn't really a hallmark of this crew either. And I think that it's sort of painstaking work that it takes to stitch together, especially 3 different countries that have, different outlooks.
So one of the things that we might expect to happen is for the White House to ask Japan and Korea to contribute more to the burden of the shared defense posture. So that could mean in terms of spending on domestic defense as a percentage of GDP. It could mean a greater share of host nation support, right? So how prepared are Korea and Japan to respond to that?
Do you want me to start? I mean, I think in some ways, the Prime Minister Ishiba's visit to the White House, there was kind of a collective, everyone in the U.S.-Japan committee was holding their breath, because anybody who knows Japanese politics knows that the Prime Minister Abe and Ishiba were not friends. And yet, the closest relationship we've seen, probably in history, between the U.S. president and prime minister was between Donald Trump and Abe. And so everyone was kind of waiting for, like, what is this going to look like? It was probably the most normal and the most managed, particularly by the alliance managers, of any of the scripts we've seen. Even the press conference between Prime Minister Ishiba and President Trump went so well that you almost had to pinch yourself. I don't think Ishiba knew what to do with himself when he was called a good-looking man and, having great leadership qualities. I don't think his own mother said those things about him. And in Japan, you don't praise each other that much. And so, I think the kind of coming out of that summit where there was a lot of pressure on Ishiba, if he had done poorly at that summit, if Trump had criticized him, I think his prime ministership would be over, right? But now, in some ways, because he was, praised so effusively, he kind of got a little bit longer lease on life in some ways, and now there's domestic scandals that are coming back. But I think the challenge is now, as Secretary Hegseth goes to the region, is about to meet with the Defense Minister Nakatani, is that going to come up? Ambassador-designate Glass has already gone before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and it said, we expect Tokyo to pay.
Yeah.
And so that discussion is ongoing. And the question for the Japanese is, we need to be proactive, but they just doubled their defense spending. So to go back to them and say, okay, you went from 1% to 2%, we need you to go to 4%, which is what Bridge Colby and some others have been suggesting, is going to be economically difficult, to put it mildly. And so I think there's kind of a dread that's setting in. And I think that from a Tokyo perspective, they're not going to litigate this in public. It's going to be done behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And I think what the noise in Washington is currently doing is making it very difficult for anyone to understand what to expect. Now, that may be part of the Trump strategy here in terms of always keeping everyone on their toes and kind of asking for this or that. The status of force agreement is going to be renegotiated under this administration. When they decide to do that and how they're going to do that through the traditional means and alliance managers, and to your point about getting rid of major elements of the workforce, it's just hard right now. I mean, the Japanese are not going to be impolite. They're not going to be very direct in the way that they confront this, but they're worried and they're preparing for the worst at this point in time.
You think SOFA is going to be renegotiated, or the SMA, the special measures?
Special measures.
Okay,
yeah.
all right,
Sorry.
okay. I was like, I don't think they're opening up to
Yeah,
SOFA. That's a
yeah.
different thing. Just rewinding a little bit, we know from the last Trump administration that burden sharing negotiations with Korea did not go well, to the extent that the special measures agreement, host nation support, whatever you want to call it, expired, leading to the furlough of thousands of Korean workers that work on U.S. bases. It went, I think, for a year and a half or something without being renewed, which I thought was a real wound in the alliance at that moment. That was a blow to the alliance. The Koreans maybe cagily, maybe wisely, preemptively renegotiated that SMA when before it expired with the Biden administration, before they left office. Now, that doesn't mean that this administration can't come right back and say, no, you did not pay nearly enough. You need to pay, triple or quadruple or whatever they were asking before. But we don't know that yet. This is one of these moments where, Korea doesn't have an elected leader, and maybe that's not the worst thing in the world because you don't have a target right now. But again, I think that the burden sharing issues are going to come to the fore in Korea and certainly in Japan. And the economic demands on Japan are just tremendous right now. You've got, after this, tremendously successful summit, 2 days later, they announced the imposition of tariffs without any exception for Japan, right? So April 2nd will show us where that's going. But on top of the tariffs, right, you have Japan aiming to double its defense spending, hasn't even gotten there, and officials in the Trump administration saying you need to spend 3% of your GDP. You've got demands to develop the gas fields in Alaska for that pipeline. That's a $44 billion project. So this is not exactly a thriving economy that Japan has right now. So the question is how far you can take that.
Yeah. And I think the uncertainty in the U.S. with what, getting rid of U.S. aid may be popular in certain electoral cycles, but U.S. aid was the largest contributor to rebuilding Japan after the major disaster on 3/11. And so when you're looking at alliance signaling, it doesn't look very good. And, most of the Japanese infrastructure of doing business in America was built on NAFTA. When you look at most of the car factories and where the component parts are coming from, they're coming from Mexico and Canada. If on April 2nd, these, tariffs are put on, it's one thing to do it to China. We all saw that one coming.
Yeah.
What I don't think many people in Japan saw coming was the targeting of Canada, the targeting of Greenland, Panama. And so, that poses a real concern in the Indo-Pacific because it's like, yeah, we understand China, we're all on board,
Right.
but let's keep our focus. And I think on security, they continue to hold out hope and focus. And I think until Korea has, a new leader or something is figured out in the courts, we're all waiting. And I think most Japanese companies and even the Japanese government are in a wait and see approach. They're kind of like, okay, there's a lot of rhetoric coming from Washington. We're only 2 months into this administration.
Yeah.
Where are things going to go? And I think tariff policy is kind of the kind of front leaner on that.
Right. And that's what we saw Prime Minister Han Duck-soo say is Korea needs a leader to work on the tariff issue. And we also saw a carve out, an exception made for Hyundai because of their massive investment into the United States. So I think we'll see a lot of negotiations ongoing looking forward here. And we're going to have a chance to dive in more on the economics, the tariffs, and Korea and Japan have a lot to contribute to the U.S. in terms of shipbuilding, which is one of the Trump administration's big priority in order to supercharge the continuing growth of the U.S. Navy. Do not currently have the domestic manufacturing capacity on that front, but Korean and Japanese companies can help make that happen, as well as others. So when you look at things holistically, you could kind of see some extra consideration going on for allies, but time will tell. I want to get into the domestic political situation of Korea and Japan and their relationship with one another. This year marks 60 years since the establishment of diplomatic relations between Korea and Japan in their modern form. I want to briefly quote Korean Ambassador Cho Hyun from a recent article by Daniel Snyder at Stanford. He said, Ambassador Cho said, "Our relationship has two bookends. On one end, we share enemies, a sense of threat, and are both allies of the U.S. But on the other bookend, Japan did so many horrible things and denies doing it. On our part, there's a sense of wounded nationalism. Diplomacy must operate between these two bookends." For Japan, Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba has been a proponent of warmer relations. But the prospect of some political change in South Korea brings up the specter of perhaps a return to the more acrimonious set of relations that we saw not just 5 years ago, right? The relationship between Korea and Japan was at pretty much a nadir. And now we've reached a new height within a very small period of time. So concerns that we could go quickly back into that direction. So of course, everything's contingent and scenario-based, but what do you think we're looking at going forward? What are the main drivers for Korea-Japan relations in each of those different capitals and the domestic public? And the last thing to mention, sorry, I'm adding a lot on here, but it's really interesting because the survey data shows this increasing friendship and feeling of favorability between the Japanese and Korean people. So in 2018, 88% of Japanese and Korean respondents had negative feelings about the other nation. This number dropped dramatically to 42% in 2023. So, I mean, I think it says something that we're measuring things in terms of like a drop in negative feelings, right?
Right.
But that's a pretty dramatic change inside a short period of time. So does that get translated politically?
I'll start on that. I mean, that's a promising number, I think, regardless, but it doesn't always trickle up to the political level. I think the sort of a conventional take is that, you know, Yoon declaring martial law and, probably, I guess, the Constitutional Court upholding his impeachment, it positions the progressives to win another election in Seoul. And traditionally, the progressives have been less warm towards Japan, and that trilateralism is not going to go well because that leg of the relationship just would not be strong. I think it's more complicated than that. It's gotten more complicated in the months since that happened. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that the progressives are going to win this election.
Yep.
And Lee, the presumed progressive standard bearer, has also said some things, at least to the Western press, that indicates maybe a pragmatic approach, I would say, to the relationship with Tokyo. So I don't think that we know that that's where we're headed.
Yeah.
The other thing is that Ishiba is going to face elections this summer as well. And I guess I'll leave it to Joshua, but my sense is that as you get closer to an election, and Ishiba has been very in favor of engaging with Korea and not the type that's going to visit the controversial Yasukuni Shrine, but he will probably face some pressure from his right flank as he approaches elections. Is that your sense, Joshua?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the trouble is that I think that there's a little bit of a mismatch here, right? Which is that Japan looms large in Korean politics, and everything from kind of the comfort women to the Japanese companies and just the whole history of colonization, et cetera. In Japan, there's kind of Korea fatigue, which is like, why do we still have to hear this? And what's interesting is if you take the trilateral out of this, it's actually really, in some ways, hard to manage. One of the kind of the driving forces on both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, obviously, Ambassador Rahm Emanuel, who we were with last week, takes full credit for this. But I think in many ways, Harry Harris should take credit for this as well. And there's been a bipartisan consensus on the importance of our two most important allies in Asia working together to be able to counteract China in different ways. But when you get into the domestic politics, I definitely think because in some ways Ishiba owes his prime ministership to Prime Minister Kishida, who was the architect in some ways of this, Ishiba is going to get a lot of push to say, hey, like, maybe you can get more political wind and by going more the Abe right-wing side of things. And of course, I don't think he's going to go to Yasukuni Shrine, but he can kind of do some head fakes and he can kind of, go in that direction. Because when you look at the kind of unprecedented way in which he became the prime minister, it wasn't because of the popular will, right? It was because of the LDP faction system being disbanded and having a popularity contest, which we don't ever have in Japan, for the LDP president, which led to him becoming prime minister. And if he's going to survive, he's got a major scandal on his hand right now, which by American standards is very small. Like, giving people $600 seems like a quaint scandal in the grand scheme of Washington. But in Japan, it's pretty serious business. And so he's going to look for any opportunity. And so, as Emma said, without an elected leader in Korea, there's no target and there's no lightning rod. But if there were to emerge a lightning rod on the other side, Ishiba should be ideologically more on the progressive wing of this, but he's going to feel compelled to hang on to his prime ministership to go the right. But I think the point you just made is a really important one. I think we underestimate how there is so much in common at the culture level. Yeah. And if I take, Tom's earlier comment about the founder of this, seminar that we're doing the in name, like if culture is what matters, I think Shohei Ohtani is probably the most popular man in Korea right now, right? Not Japan, in Korea. And I think some of the most popular men in Japan besides Shohei Ohtani are from K-pop or from soap operas, right? Because I think there's a lot of an appreciation on both sides. Yeah. And I think the question is, are both sides big enough to look past this? Is a prime minister of Japan willing to look the other way when, for political gain, somebody does something in the Korean system and the Korean system can kind of talk things down and the diplomats and bureaucrats can calm the nerves of the extremes on both sides here. And that's what historically the U.S. and the good offices do. I'm worried that that may not be the case because, again, I think most of the Trump administration focus is not on Korea and Japan. It's right here at home and about making America great, which is a very different concept than trying to balance alliances and trying to manage rising powers like China.
Right.
I think the question too is, yes, we know the difficult past between Korea and Japan, and certainly the last time Trump was in office, that relationship just really foundered. There was not a lot of alliance management being done from Washington, but the stakes are higher now, and I hope that the leadership in Seoul and in Tokyo realize that we don't. I mean, they could face difficult alliances with the United States and the turbulent security environment right now in Northeast Asia, with Russia getting much more involved, and its partnership with North Korea, Trump having a warmer relationship with Putin, possibly using that as an avenue to finish his unfinished business with North Korea. They're going to face some similar challenges, maybe just the way that Trump approaches North Korea and other factors in the region. So I hope that they're going to sort of weather the storm and at least keep up their degree of cooperation without having to have the United States in the center of that trilateral arrangement.
Another big change among the general publics in Japan and Korea, I don't know the extent of the change in Japan, but I do know in Korea is this rising anti-Chinese sentiment. And that has also bubbled up to the political level as well. So I'm not exactly sure to what extent that's the case in Japan. Maybe there was a lot of already anti-Chinese sentiment. But on those grounds, we could see the perception of a need to cooperate between Japan and Korea. And then I wonder, and this is an open question, I just don't know. General MacArthur once referred to Taiwan as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, right? While Korea and Japan are also unsinkable aircraft carriers. So just purely if you're the U.S. and you're a strategist and your priority is on strategic competition with China, perhaps Japan and Korea, those allies can be seen as an asset in that regard as well. Any thoughts on that?
I just want to be added to a signal chat on that, and then I would know. I mean, this is the thing. We don't know Trump's approach to China right now, right? The things that I hear in Washington are that there's no appetite for a grand bargain, but I don't know that those people are really in the inner circle, and the inner circle is mostly inside Trump's head anyway. He gets to decide. But I think there's some anxiety for our Indo-Pacific allies that there is going to be some sort of grand bargain that would be mostly an economic bargain that would address some of the deficit concerns, and that Taiwan's status would be softer, or the assurances would not be as strategically ambiguous as they are right now, and that would leave our allies really concerned. But I also don't have a strong read on what the progressives' view on China is now, and how that policy would be different than Yoon's. I mean, there's an assumption again about it being less strident rhetoric against China and being less willing to sign on to the kind of statements that the United States was making in the last administration. But times have changed, so that may well be different than what we knew about the progressives' policy agenda before.
I mean, one of the interesting things in Japanese politics is that Ishiba has been seen as much more friendly towards China than either Kishida or Abe before him. And particularly in this moment in time where there was a lot of uncertainty about whether or not the Trump administration 2.0 was going to go back to its rhetoric from 1.0. There are a lot of China hawks in the administration. But if they're not the ones calling the shots, it doesn't, it's not Marco Rubio or Mike Waltz who are going to be calling the shots. It's President Trump himself, who has said numerous times that he respects President Xi. There are some in Japan that say, well, maybe we should, embrace, because if there's going to be a bifurcation between a security-led order and an economic order, we can't be caught in the middle. Mm-hmm. Like, we need to make sure we protect our own economic interests and security interests. In the case of Taiwan, it's very interesting to look at, because I think Japan has become even more stridently focused on Taiwan's independence. Mm-hmm. And we're talking today about trilateral in the case of U.S., Japan, Korea, but there was just a trilateral between the U.S., China, and Japan in Japan that was pretty unprecedented, because the Japanese came out and corrected the Foreign Ministry of China's characterization of this, which, for Japanese to come out and criticize the official statement is a pretty significant thing, right? And so I think there is obviously tension there, but I think whatever comes out of Washington and whatever the signal's coming, and I think the tariffs are going to be the first one because, it looks like the tariffs for China are there, but they don't seem to be as severe as what we're currently hitting Canada with, which is not what many people expected 2 months ago. And so I think Japan is kind of in a wait and see. But I think what's interesting, to Emma's point, and reinforce it, not just on the political level, here in the United States too, Korean and Japanese companies are facing the exact same things.
Right.
And in many ways, if you try to compete and lobby individually, you're going to fail. But if you come together and you can present a united front and you can have a stronger economic argument for why your company is doing something good for this senator, this congressperson, this person who's going to call Trump and lobby him on your behalf, that will go a much better way. That is not something that traditionally Japanese are as good at doing, but they're learning quickly in this Washington.
Yeah, let's skip ahead to the trilateral Korea-Japan China meeting, which happened this past weekend in Tokyo. Phil, I'm glad to hear your insights there, because I was reading through the news articles, reading some analysis. I'm having trouble myself is this a nothing burger? What's significant about this? I know they're setting up more meetings, and they were discussing things like aging population. That's something that all three societies share. How can they cooperate to tackle that? I don't think there's anything much that they could do on that front. Green economy, they discussed, natural disaster response. But I'm searching for, where is the meat here? Is this a real significant development? Some discussion of RCEP, right? So kind of interesting on that front. But was there really anything meaningful to this meeting? What does it set up, or what does it fail to set up?
I think the major deliverable of this trilateral Korea, Japan, China meeting was that the meeting happened, and that's I think it speaks to what we underscored before, in that there's a desire to stabilize those relationships while we wait to see where Trump is going to go in the Indo-Pacific. So. Yeah, the agenda, those are the things you can put on any bilateral, or trilateral agenda. But it makes you talk to each other, And so I think that they didn't have those for many years, those trilateral talks, until last year. They had one in Seoul. But I think it had been 5 or 6 years before that. I mean, the pandemic played a role in that. But the fact that those leaders or senior officials will come together and actually have that conversation, I think, is somewhat significant.
When I think the other thing that's significant is, at least when you look at the global architecture of things, and certainly at the Munich Security Conference, the Chinese foreign minister got his own keynote. And the Japanese and Korean foreign minister was kind of relegated to a side discussion with like the New Zealand foreign minister and others. And I think that really rubbed people in Japan the wrong way, particularly because in Japan, there's a lot of appreciation for what Europe is facing in terms of all the issues. Like, all the issues you just mentioned could be on the agenda for U.S., EU, Japan, right? And so I think that, in many ways, Korea and Japan are on the same equation and facing many of the same challenges. And in some ways, maybe if the Americans are the bad cop, and then the Koreans and Japanese need to be the good cop to kind of keep the Chinese on board and not let them do mischievous things and send their ships and coast guards into places they shouldn't be going. And North Korea is a real problem right now. The gloves are off. We've got major conflict here. We've got this major question mark about where U.S.-Russia relations are going to go, and that could really upend and change a lot of things in the region. Japan, it feels very vulnerable because they were kind of the only G7 nation who's from Asia that is like doing something against their own national interests. Remember, Abe had more meetings with Putin than any other world leader, and here we are. I grew up in Hokkaido, the northern part of Japan, that is very close to Russia. They're doing things that are against their national interest, and they're doing it because it's the right thing to do and based on international order. And then the captain of that team is suddenly saying, you know what? We're going to change. We're going to flip this around, and let's go to Saudi Arabia. Let's see what we can do. So, I think they feel very vulnerable, and I think that is an opportunity for Korea and Japan. Korea feels very vulnerable because of its domestic situation, and in all of that, that's why I was heartened to see the pushback from the Japanese foreign ministry. Because if it had been all platitudes coming out of that, I would have been worried that, wow, China's diplomacy is really winning the day. Because when it comes to soft power, we shot a massive own goal against ourselves by getting rid of exchange programs, Fulbright, US aid, all these things that are not that costly in the grand scheme of things, but in terms of soft power, important. And I see the influence of China everywhere I walk in New York City and where I go other places, even though we have acknowledged that that is our major competitor in the international environment. I want to see what the U.S. is going to do, but we don't know. But I do know where Japan is going, but they also have to watch out for their own national interests, just like South Korea does.
And I'm sure Korea watching with bated breath how things develop in Ukraine, given that the Yoon administration in the past had done kind of a three-card Monte to give artillery to the United States to free up U.S. stocks so that the U.S. could give to Ukraine to use against Russia. And then eventually, I wonder if any of those shells were used against North Korean soldiers in the Kursk province of Russia. And this has emerged as kind of like a little proxy war of the Koreans, North and South, against one another. So a little bit of exposure there, and also just a sign of the times, how things are developing, how that gets resolved. Big implications for the relationship with North Korea going forward, how that gets meted out, and leading to some questions about how the United States and is Donald Trump going to be able to rekindle this personal relationship with Kim Jong-un and tip off another series of summitry. What is Japan's point of view going to be if that tips off? And South Korea, because last time South Korea played such an important role setting things up, right, through the Pyeongchang Olympics and turning things around from fire and fury, and then leading into this spring of summitry. But this time, I'm not so sure. The North Koreans are not eager to engage with the South Koreans and symbolically blew up the Inter-Korean Liaison Office in the DMZ, signifying that they no longer view Seoul as a worthwhile channel. So Korea could potentially be pushed to the sides, and perhaps Japan as well.
Well, this gets right at the heart of the commitment to consult in the Camp David Accords, right? This idea that leaders, before consult with one another, and Donald Trump prides himself very much on going directly to the decision maker in that places. So I do not see him abiding by that tenet of the Camp David Accords at all. And I think there's fear in Seoul and in Tokyo that Trump will want to go right to Kim Jong-un. I think he'd love to, bring peace to the Korean Peninsula as a legacy thing there, and work out a deal with North Korea. But that's obviously the devil's in the details, and there's a lot of devils in all of those details. Trump has said since coming to office that North Korea is a nuclear power. Going directly against the denuclearization goal that was mentioned at the Trilateral Foreign Ministers meeting. So I think that there's a deep fear of marginalization in both of those capitals. And I don't want to go too far down this path, but if there is some sort of deal worked out where North Korea gets to keep its nuclear weapons, and that whatever technology they've received from Russia, which we assume is something significant in terms of missile capabilities, suddenly the North Korean credibility to hit the United States in their homeland is considerably stronger, and then extended deterrence starts to crumble. I think even more than it is now, which is shaky. And then we see, an appetite in Korea at least to have its own nuclear arsenal, which would put pressure on some in Japan to do that. And I think that would tear Japan apart because its society is not there. So again, I know I'm taking this a little bit too far, but these scenarios are more realistic than they have been in the past.
Yeah, look, 2 years ago or more, I guess, if you had told me that Japan, they're not even dancing around it the way Korea is. They're directly assisting Ukraine. And in some ways, at Munich, it was very clear that the Japanese knew where they were on Ukraine. It was the Americans that weren't sure where they were in terms of whether they were going to meet with the Ukrainians and what a unified Europe and kind of a Europe that can defend itself. Japan's clearly on that side, and now they feel exposed. And it's a little bit like the TPP all over again, where they weren't all that excited about joining it, but the Americans dragged them in, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, we're out, our domestic politics. So you got to lead yourself, and then they have to come up with a CPTPP and all these things. So, we are seeing Japan, on the one hand, really step up as a global leader, but that can very easily be unraveled by domestic politics. And going back to the crux of our conversation here, it could very easily be derailed with a different government in Seoul that decides to reopen wounds. And instead of celebrating the 60 years, using that as an opportunity to just bludgeon each other and kind of make that difficult. And I think the challenge, of course, is in an American audience, it's like trying to explain these historical differences. You're like, well, why do you care? Is anybody around from that? Well, it makes a big difference in terms of your national identity and the way we think about things. But I think it could very easily explode. And in a global context that is as volatile as it is now, that is the last thing we need. And so I think that is where I think Japan is, in comparison to the domestic politics here and in Korea, Japan seems quite boring, but it's actually very exciting by Japanese standards, right? And we have an upper house election in July. There could at any moment be an election called. That's what's exciting about parliamentary systems, right? Versus presidential, where there's kind of a system, but then again, there's a constitutional crisis everywhere these days, it feels, and what the court is going to decide will determine who's president or not in Korea and maybe here as well. So I think that is pretty unprecedented. We're used to having like one or two unprecedented, but we're getting sick of how unprecedented everything has become. And I think in the Japanese case, there is just fatigue of saying, well, we'll be a global leader and we're going to do all these things. This year is the World Expo in Osaka. And so why can't we focus on that as like where Korea and Japan can come together? Both countries have hosted numerous expos and they have a lot of kind of opportunity. There's a lot of private sector. Baseball unifies us all with both Korean and Japanese players and national teams, et cetera. But, that's not what we're talking about right now. We're talking about signal. We're talking about security. We're talking about Ukraine. We're talking about Gaza. And that's, from a Korean and Japanese point of view, that's all great. But those are all regional. Like the real crux of a major conflict is either in North Korea or Taiwan. That's where the World War begins with China. Because in these other contexts, they're proxies. They're not direct competitors in that way.
Is there not a version of events where Trump's style of direct engagement with Russia and North Korea makes Japan and Korea safer?
Safer? I think it could drive more cooperation. But I don't think anything in that scenario says that we're safer.
I mean, there are those in Japan from my home island who would agree with you from a realpolitik point of view that if a deal is cut, a grand bargain is made between Putin and Trump, and this is what I'm hearing, right? It's like, well, what America really wants is kind of the Western Hemisphere. We want a beefed up version of the Monroe Doctrine, and we'll leave Asia more or less to Chinese influence, and then we'll leave Eurasia and Europe to the Russians. I don't think that works because there's a lot more countries in the world than there were the last time we had the spheres of influence. I don't think the Turks will be particularly happy about that. I don't think the Indians are going to agree to it. I don't think the Brazilians are going to agree to it. So it seems like a fantasy to me, but I can see how that logic from a populist point of view could work. And I think in the case of North Korea, it's something that is so quirky in some way. So in Japan, the big issue in North Korea is about the abductees, right? Yeah. That is the driving force of domestic politics. If that could be settled, in some ways, if you had a really anti-Japanese government in South Korea, I could easily see a more nationalist right-wing Japanese be willing to find ways of working in a realpolitik way with North Korea, but not in the current context, because I think to the point, like it's not, that seems like a really far stretch for me.
I just talked to a lot of my students from my class are here today, and I talked to them this past week about the role of regional players in denuclearization diplomacy, and I tried to impress upon them how important the abductees issue was for the Japanese government and how progress there has enabled cooperation and lack of progress has really just made it impossible. And at this point, are we past the point of no return where there's just no way that they're alive, or if they are alive, they've just been through such a horrible treatment that North Korea would be foolish to release them and then have the horrors of their experience be exposed to the outside world. It seems like there's just no way that they're coming back, and this is irreparable damage to Japan-North Korea relations.
I mean, we've seen a couple of attempts to try and get a deal just on the abductees, and it's always failed. I think that is probably because there are no good answers. North Korea does not have any satisfactory answers. All the news would be bad news. So I think that is, it continues to be a stumbling block to Japan being meaningfully engaged in any sort of negotiations, multilateral negotiations. Six-party talks have not been, particularly thriving anyway. But I think that it was to Japan's. I understand the domestic trauma of it and why it had such potency as a political issue in Japan. But in terms of Japan's actual security, the missiles and the nuclear weapons are far more important. So we're going back to a time when we were all talking, and no one's talking now. But I think the abductee issue will continue to be a wound for many that is hard to get past.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it actually could be an opportunity for South Korea and Japan to overcome their own open wounds, right? Because I think that the longer you get away from the history and the actual, like, there's no one that can come out now. There's no abductee that comes out and says, it's okay, I forgive you.
Yeah.
Because they're all gone and it's going to be family. And, we're seeing this play out in real time in the Gaza-Israel situation, where every single time another hostage is released, it becomes actually an open wound. And it makes the Israeli public even more angry and makes it almost, we're further away from peace every time that happens. Yeah. In the Japanese North Korea case, that's long gone. We're talking decades at this point. Yeah. There's no good answers, as Emma said. But I do think that it also takes political leadership. And I think right now in Japan, there is that lack of leadership across the board, right? Mm-hmm. The prime minister is incredibly weak because his party is not ruling as a majority like it's used to for most of Japanese history. On the business side, there are not those individual leaders who are courageously stepping forward and offering those opportunities. I think one of the only areas we're seeing some of that diplomacy is through sports diplomacy, right? And so whether it's baseball or the Winter Olympics or the Summer Olympics or the upcoming FIFA, you're going to see those countries coming there, and they seem to be able to do things that their leaders can't. But that is mostly in the cultural realm. It's not like a Korean and a Japanese soccer player are going to solve all the issues between the countries.
Right. Only ping pong players can do that. Yeah. Okay, so let's get to economics. So U.S. has a free trade agreement with Korea. U.S. has a critical minerals agreement with Japan. During their trilateral foreign ministers meeting, the three countries discussed Japan and Korea purchasing U.S. LNG, large amounts, and the three countries pledged cooperation on supply chain resilience and advanced technologies like semiconductors and nuclear reactors. Shipbuilding, as we mentioned before, is another area for potential cooperation. However, both Japan and Korea have a very large goods trade deficit with the United States. It's actually a pretty similar amount as well. And so this will become an issue, right? And so tariffs, the announcement is coming up around April 2nd, and we don't know if security allies like Japan, the United States, and Korea are going to get any kind of preferential treatment or not. So how do we assess the future of economic relations? So Emma first, then Joshua.
We just know that Trump views the world through the lens of trade deficits. That has been consistent since the 80s, and I think that is going to be very difficult for either country to get over without significantly addressing that. And even the types of investments, I think it depends on which kind of measure you use, whether or not Japan or Korea are the largest foreign investors in the United States. Even getting that up to $1 billion, which is what Ichiba had pledged during his summit, doesn't get that far in terms of reducing that. So again, I think that we're going to see if there's any exceptions for our allies in terms of the imposition of tariffs. We'll know that fairly soon, I guess. But the indication so far is that we're tougher on our allies with these tariff measures. So I do think that Trump made clear that energy exports is high on his agenda of the way that he wants to build revenue. He sees, I think, this pipeline in Alaska as a way to get, not just for Japan, but for all of Asia. He wants to, make Japan sort of like the great distributor of LNG to the rest of Asia. But that project is massive and not coming online anytime too soon. So
what would that pipeline do? It would go from Alaska to Japan?
Well, no, it would go just to the port, and then in the form of LNG, it would be shipped. But it's a much shorter trip from Alaska than it is, to going from the Gulf of Mexico America. There's advantages to it,
Yeah.
but it's a massive investment, and my understanding is that Japanese companies are sort of dubious about its business value.
Yeah, no, I think, again, the economics is where particularly Japan has a lot of power and leverage and strength here, because it's very clear that, I mean, so Japan is not the number one target, right? It's number 7, I think. So I think Japanese are kind of breathing a sigh of relief. But again, if your first couple of ones are not going to be the ones that you hit, and they say there's no exceptions, right now the major conversation is about Nippon Steel, right? About what happened there and what happens to the U.S. steel industry if this doesn't go through, and how is that going to affect the U.S.-Japan alliance, which, obviously there's domestic politics, the
Can you
reason for
briefly
that.
remind us what's going on there?
So those of you who are not familiar with the Nippon Steel case, you have this major Japanese steel manufacturer that comes in and offers to buy U.S. steel, and U.S. Steel agrees to this. And then basically because of politics, there's union workers who say, we don't like this deal. U.S. Steel happens to be headquartered in Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania during a presidential election where Pennsylvania is the swing state among all swing states. The Japanese, kind of the Nippon Steel didn't seem to have brought much of its coalition together. Many Japanese officials were caught surprised by this, and it happened right at the middle of this period. Because of that's when the auction, and there's a domestic bid from Cleveland Cliffs that's a lot lower. So, but the bottom line is you have the narrative that you have a Japanese company taking over an iconic American company, of which the Pittsburgh Steelers were named after, and some of the top things in New York City, Chrysler Tower, et cetera.
I thought you were going to get through this answer without a sports reference, and you couldn't.
I can't do it. I always come back to sports in
Okay,
some way.
yeah.
Otani, can I say it again? So you have that case going on, and it's really a lot of the private sector has been shook by this, because when you look at the way that Japanese investment, they think the way you can get through tariffs is to invest further in America. But when you're told, wait a minute, you're just as bad as the Chinese, which is what the Cleveland Cliffs has been saying about Japan, like you can't allow the Japanese, it reopens wounds from the 1980s when the last time we heard a lot about the Japan bashing. And so that's why Nippon Steel has become this big flashpoint. Then fast forward to all the economic issues that we're talking about, there's a little bit of a reticence to say, okay, we know that we can't invest in China right now because of supply chain resiliency, because that's a no-go zone. But is our investment safe in America? Because if the business logic is there and the CEO of U.S. Steel and the company itself wants to be acquired, what do we do? And one of the talking points between President Trump and Prime Minister Ishiba was, let's come up with some euphemistic ways of describing this. So you won't own it, you'll simply control it. I don't know what that means. Yeah. I don't think anybody knows what that means. But right now, Nippon Steel is suing President Biden, and they're very clear. It's not President Trump. They're suing President Biden, and this is an opportunity for Trump to be a hero. And so the question is, if he does want to make a deal and wants to get more investment, how will that play out? And I'm sure Korean companies are watching this as well, because there's this similar motif out there of like, okay, well, we invested so much in these areas for semiconductors and for infrastructure, and now you're going to do a whole thing of Make America.
Yeah.
And this whole episode with Nippon Steel also sort of undercut all of the work on economic security that the United States and Japan and Korea did under the Biden administration, because this whole idea of friendshoring, you can maybe talk the talk, but you can't walk the walk when it actually comes to it. So it was damaging in that way too.
Yeah. Okay, let's get to our bold predictions for the future, and then we're going to turn to our audience, and we'll actually end the live stream. So an incentive to all of you watching virtually, you should come in person to the Korea Society so you can get this excellent opportunity to ask in-person questions to our wonderful speakers. So, bold prediction, what do we think lies in store for U.S. Korea-Japan trilateral relations? Anyone eager to go first?
Well, I'm a recovering CRS analyst, which means that I'm not particularly good at being bold or making predictions of any sort. But I do think an area to watch is whether or not we have an alignment of North Korea, Russia, and the United States, even up to the level, high-level symmetry happening. If that specter, however that an arrangement would come out, could drive not just South Korea and Japan cooperation, and maybe reinforce this notion that the stakes are higher than they've ever been, but possibly even open up some avenues of cooperation with China, because that would be looking at a real reorder in the region. Is that
Excellent, Joshua.
bold?
I think that's
I
pretty
couldn't
bold.
say that if I were CRS, so it's at least going that
So
direction.
let me start with the fun one before I get to the negative ones. I think the fun one is that I think that the ubiquitousness of Korean food and Japanese food, which is taking the U.S. by storm,
Yeah.
is at some point in time going to reach its peak of kind of an Iron Chef competition between the Japanese and the Chinese and the Koreans, and they're both going to dominate the Chinese in many ways. And so I think whether it's in architecture, whether it's in K-pop, whether it's in animation, whether it's in video games, I think that in some ways all the things we see here in New York, whether it's a Japan Day parade or whether it's Korea, celebration and heritage of Korean Americans, Japanese, I see them going closer and closer, which is a good thing, and I think that could be driven. The challenge there is, where does America find itself in that period of time?
Mhm.
I would hope that the legislative bodies would, regardless of what's happening at the top level, would kind of continue to try to foster the good relations you're talking about, find reasons, because there's economic incentives, there's reasons that everyone wants to do this. It's so easy to get, it's almost like a domestic trip between Korea and Japan for baseball and
I
for
know it's coming.
the other
Yeah,
areas
yeah.
there. So how can you do that? And I guess on the negative side, to pick up where Emma left off, it does scare me a little bit that you might have less and less trilateral, but more and more bilateral between Korea and Japan, because they see their incentives in the Indo-Pacific. They see their incentives of not being left behind and wanting to figure out ways of working together on climate change and other things that maybe America is no longer going to be interested in.
And with other regional partners,
Absolutely.
with Australia,
Yes.
with India,
Yes.
with the Philippines.
Could be viewed as an opportunity to step up.
Absolutely.
Global pivotal state, regional pivotal players, Japan and Korea.
Yep.
Please help me in thanking and giving a warm round of applause to our wonderful speakers today, Joshua and Emma. Thank you so much for joining us. Come back. We've got a lot of sessions coming up. We've got Huang Yinggu and Ed Baker talking about politics of the vortex 2025. Then we've got Minnie Mills talking about acting and activism. She was on Netflix's The Summer I Turned Pretty and is also a North Korean human rights activist. Then on April 30th, we've got a roundtable with Ambassador Raymond Burkhart, who is right here on U.S. relations with Taiwan and other Asian allies. And then a book talk with Ankit Panda, his new book about nuclear proliferation. So join us for all that fun stuff. You should be a member of the Korea Society. It's so much fun. If you're interested in that, Stephanie's in the back and you could do it online. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.